The Clemson Tigers remain atop the ACC standings, but after an ugly performance in a loss to Boston College on Tuesday, they are looking more fraudulent than ever before.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is up? Welcome to the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, and this episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. All right, thrilled to be joined today by Leif Thulin of the Locked On NBA Big Board. We are going to discuss the ACC after the conference's number one team, the Clemson Tigers, fell on the road Tuesday afternoon or Tuesday evening against lowly Boston College. Leif, I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this Clemson team in general. We'll talk a little bit more broadly about the ACC and kind of what this means for them, but does this loss to Boston College really tell us anything more about Clemson than maybe what we already knew? Or is this kind of a situation where, hey, maybe they were good and now they have kind of fallen off? Or what's your take on this team, especially after this loss?
Yeah, I think we knew the reality of Clemson was that they were winning close games against not very good teams. And not to say that Boston College is a good team and it ran out of luck, but I think that this team was kind of riding the record rather than the substance of what has created that record. I watched the tail end of that game, and obviously when you score that few of points, it's a bad offensive game, but it's nothing super novel for them. They have gone through offensive woes. They've just played an easier schedule than the rest of the ACC. So if you were to ask me the rankings for the ACC a couple weeks ago, like Isaac did, I would have told you going to finish high, but in terms of the quality of a team, I would have told you Clemson's about 5th or 6th.
Yeah.
So this is nothing new. I tweeted, and I think we kind of laughed about this over Twitter, is I tweeted Clemson equals frauds because a lot of people were saying, well, Clemson could win the ACC because they've got 2 games against the bottom dwellers. And that's entirely possible. But that said, I like to view it as a holistic view in terms of college basketball. How would I rank them to teams that I consider to be good teams? I don't think anyone in the ACC is going to be blowing the doors off people, even though Virginia is ranked very highly. Virginia is the best team in the ACC. And I would say Miami, Duke, and Carolina, which is no surprise, are the top 4. And then Clemson and Pitt can fight out for 5 and 6. And I just think you're seeing the lack of offense finally reach ahead where scouting has gotten better, and Clemson's really got to scrap so hard to score that it's hard to defensively subdue teams long enough. And Boston College is not a good offensive team either. So to lose that game is, I think, a signs for what's to come. But it has been an impressive coaching job by Brad Brumell.
Yeah, I think they've accomplished a lot with what they have, and what they have basically is Hunter Tyson. And not a ton else. Cameron Hunter's a solid player as well, but you look at this Boston College game, and it's really kind of encapsulates how much they are reliant on Tyson to get pretty much anything done. He had 6 of the team's 16 field goals, 4 of their 6 3-pointers, 6 of their 16 made free throws, like 22 of their 54 points. Like, he was a monster in this game. He was efficient. He was solid, but there's not anybody else on this team who's getting anything done. One of their starters had 0 points. One of their starters had 2 points. Like, they only had one other player in double figures, and that was Cameron Hunter, who had 12 points, and he was 4 of 14 from the field, 0 of 5 from deep. So not exactly a productive performance from him. Like, I look at this Clemson team, and you're right. I see basically the same things that you're seeing, a team that got some decent wins, but mostly got close wins over average teams. And really, I think their spot, and correct me if I'm wrong, or let me know what you think on this, but for me, I'm looking at a team that their spot atop the standings says a lot more about the traditional powers of the ACC, like North Carolina, like Duke, like Virginia and Miami to an extent. It says more about them that they're not the teams atop the standings, and Clemson is. Does that feel about right to you?
Yeah, I would say that the only reason that they have a chance to still finish top 3 is the loaded schedule, where they play Louisville twice, where they play some of the worst teams twice. But I agree. I think the headline this year was, man, Carolina returns absolutely everyone except for Brady Manick, and this team should be better because they'll mature. And then they didn't live up to expectations.
Right.
Duke had all these talented freshmen and were a top 10 team coming in, haven't really shown what they can do, but they're starting to get better. Virginia, I think, has been what people expected, and they've had really good stretches, and they're in a pretty good stretch right now.
Yeah.
And then have had a few stretches where you're like, okay, this is the Virginia team that was a good team that could win an ACC, but isn't going to advance rather than being one of their championship contending teams. And I think that can still be true, but they're the class of the ACC, but I wouldn't say it's the class of an ACC. The ACC is just super proud of, because in past, like in 2019, you had 3 number 1 seeds, and like you had like 8 teams in the top 6 of the seed lines. And when you look at Ken Palm, and I've told you this before, and I say the same thing with Isaac, is I like to make the assessment of how good a team is with my eyes, and I like to check Ken Palm just to see, like, does it line up consistently with it? Well, Clemson's 67th. They are 93rd on offense and 49th on defense. And if you look at those numbers, and then you look at the record, those don't line up whatsoever.
Not at all.
Poor competition. So, like, what's Clemson, a 9 seed? Like, how would the class of the ACC be a 9 seed?
Right.
So I think eventually the basketball product they put on the court shows up, and I think yesterday was the first sign of that. So I think they end up being the fourth seed in the ACC, and it's just because they started well, and that's a credit. Winning games is ugly, and like sometimes we've talked about this. Virginia and St. Mary's, they win games in a relatively ugly fashion, but they do so consistently and within their fashion of basketball that I think it's something that you can replicate. I don't think Clemson can continue to replicate it the further into conference play.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% on that. And looking at Clemson right now, their next 4 games, they got Miami at home, they're at North Carolina, they got Florida State at home, and they got Louisville at home. So again, not the most difficult schedule. You can see almost certainly a win against Louisville there. You can see Florida State, obviously an opportunity for a victory there, a team that could beat Clemson but is not going to be favored. And then you have Miami and North Carolina, and on the road at North Carolina, if Clemson pulls that off, we might be having a very different conversation, but I have a hard time believing that that's something they're capable of doing. So you're looking at maybe 2-2 in this stretch of games. Pretty likely that they're 1-3 in this stretch of games, or at least it's possible they're 1-3 in that stretch of games. And then, that kind of changes the conversation. Pitt, they also have to go on the road at North Carolina coming up. That's their next game, but they have Louisville, Florida State, Boston College are their 3 games after that. There's a pretty good chance they go 3-1 through that stretch of games right there. So I think you're looking at a situation where a couple weeks from now, the standings might end up looking a lot different. In Virginia, they have a relatively soft schedule coming up as well. They got at Virginia Tech, they got North Carolina State, not an easy game, but they are at home. They got Duke at home, and then they're on the road at Louisville. So pretty good chance for a team that's absolutely rolling right now in Virginia that they win their next 4 games. If that's the case, Clemson's time atop the standings in the ACC might be coming to an end very, very soon.
Yeah, I have the same read, and one thing I think that I haven't asked yet is if you were to look at Clemson's roster, and it's a credit to Brad Brumwell more than anything, but aside from the production you're going to get from maybe your 3 best players, how do they just stay pace with some of these ACC rosters, even if they're not playing well? Like if they're going to play Duke again. Which I don't actually know if they would, but just for the sake of example, like, I don't see how you manufacture multiple wins against these type of teams that just have guys that can score, and multiple of them. Obviously, Duke is an exceptionally talented team, but even in the case of like Virginia Tech has more scores, even though they've been bad to start the year. Syracuse, more scores. I just think that they're playing with fire in the way that they play basketball. And at the end of the game, this is the best example. They tied the game up at 45, and then were hoisting threes, like no past possessions. Yeah. And it was like, man, well, the way we're going to keep pace here is we're going to have to score threes. And they were all not well constructed possessions. And so I'd be, if I'm a Clemson fan, which I'm not, but if I were, I would be a little bit concerned that my team's going to slip to bubble watch, because you've been a lock in the thing because you've been the top seed. Right. Well, now that you're not, and you're going to run into some more difficult teams, I'd be a little bit concerned that this team, the way their roster is constructed, they're a bubble team. Yeah. And maybe that's even overachieving compared to where I saw them entering the season. But so I'd be pretty concerned if I'm a Clemson fan.
All right, Leif, well, we have a pair of inconsistent but well-hyped NBA draft prospects to break down in Emoni Bates and Jalen Hood-Schifino. But before we do that, today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL playoffs are here, and we are so excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they're the number one sports book in America. That's right, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. New customers join today to get started with $150 in free bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Just sign up at FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel has all your favorite bets from the money line to point spreads to player props. Plus, you can even combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. We'll have a few upset picks for you to consider later in the show. Take them or leave them. But either way, bet comfortably on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So basketball fans, don't miss out. Place your first $5 bet to get $150 in free bets, win or lose, at FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, Leif, we are talking about a couple of highly touted draft prospects. I know, obviously, that with your position on the Locked On NBA Big Board, you're kind of paying attention to how these prospects are kind of panning out and some inconsistencies for some of these guys. And one of the games that I wanted to talk about that happened on Tuesday, we can kind of talk about it through the lens of Indiana freshman Jalen Hood-Schifino, because he had a really, really bad game, and he'd been kind of getting some momentum, some hype as a true freshman guard, kind of starting to crop up more on draft boards, moving up in those spots because of his performance earlier in the month of January. And then against Maryland on Tuesday night, Hood-Schifino comes out 3 points, 1 of 14 shooting. Horrendous night from him. It kind of encapsulated some of the issues we've seen from Indiana all year long, where Trace Jackson Davis, he was awesome. 18 points, 20 rebounds, a monster performance from TJD, and he didn't have any help around him. And they end up getting 55 points. Again, 18 of them coming from Trace Jackson Davis, only 3 coming from Hood-Schifino. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts on Hood-Schifino in general as a draft prospect, especially considering some of the wild inconsistencies we've seen from him thus far for the Hoosiers.
I think the first thing from a college basketball perspective, he's their X factor. If he's playing well, Indiana's a really good team. If he's not, they really struggle. And even though they were in this game with Maryland, it was clear that they weren't going to be able to sustain pace just playing through TJD. Like, they had another game kind of similar to this recently against Minnesota, where Jalen Hood-Schifino struggled, going 2 of 11, and Trace Jackson Davis willed them to victory against a poor Minnesota team. My take from an NBA draft perspective on Jalen Hood-Schifino is that the best thing that happened to his prospect was when Xavier Johnson got hurt, and he got more time at the point guard and got more shots up, because Xavier Johnson's still a scoring-oriented guard.
Right.
That said, it's putting a necessary burden on him to need to score, and I think teams are now able to key in on him a little more. So you're going to have a game like against Ohio State where he goes 8 for 12, 6 of 9 from 3, and then they followed it by scoring 3 points. And 1 of 14. So I think he's having growing pains that all young players do that take prominent roles. But I think in a way you have to give him a little bit of leeway, in the sense that he wasn't prepared to have this role. And I think it's different than if you kind of groomed yourself into the role throughout the entire year. He's a guy that I think, like, if he were to come out, which I'm not certain he will, that he could go at the very end of the first round, or he could be an early second round pick, and you kind of groom him to be a scorer off the bench who has the capacity to run the point. He's someone that I've had my eye on a little bit entering the year, because one of my friends went to Indiana, and we've kind of been talking about him. And I said, well, your team is projected to win the Big Ten. I'm not quite there yet. I thought Illinois would personally, but I kept telling him, I was like, if Jalen Hood-Schifino can be a real threat to score 15 on most nights, then you have a chance to be the best Indiana team you've had in plenty of years. And I think that's been consistent with what we've seen. And can he facilitate an offense is something that I'd want to know as an executive if I were drafting. Like, am I drafting a point guard or a 2 guard that is not like extremely dynamic, but he's skilled? So there are questions, but I think he can answer them this final month entering the tournament, because his role has now been defined. It's been solidified, and now he's going to have that time to grow into that role.
Well, that kind of leads to another question I have that's related to both Emoni Bates, who we're going to talk about, and Hood-Schifino to an extent, of when you're evaluating prospects and when you're evaluating college players in particular, like obviously a huge part of that conversation is evaluating what role they have on their college basketball team and how that may differ when they get into the NBA. And we see, I mean, we quite frankly, we see scouts, we see general managers, we see them make this mistake a lot where they draft a player who's maybe a high volume scorer and they try to put him into a role in the NBA where they're coming off the bench and they're, they have to get hot in a hurry and they're a microwave scorer, and guys don't always adjust to that. And so what I'm hearing here with Hood-Schifino is that he's been thrust into a different role. It's maybe not a role he's going to have in the NBA. And so do you think that kind of makes it almost more complicated when trying to evaluate him? Do you think staying back at school and maybe being in a situation where he gets a role that maybe more mirrors what he would do in the NBA would be helpful for him? Or is it just kind of a, hey, we're going to draft the talent and we're going to see if it fits?
Well, it comes with risk, obviously. Like you could hurt your stock, but I think if he were to return to school, he's got a higher chance to be a higher pick, right. Higher as in like better pick rather than numerically higher. That said, I think there's a real argument if he were to leave this year, you could have a team draft him at the tail end of the first round and say, your role is going to be, you're going to be a supplementary ball handler that runs the second unit. And if you exceed that expectation, then you've got a chance to be that in the front, in the first rotation of players. And I don't see him being an NBA star, but I do think he's a capable player that can impact winning at the NBA level, give it a few years. If I were him, I would return to school. That said, the only pause there is I doubt Trace Jackson Davis would. And so you don't know what that Indiana team's going to be. It would be his team, but it's hard to be the man and then have such a burden and then have your game transition. Now he's the star of a team, and now he's thrust back to role player. So I actually did a podcast not too long ago, just a small shameless plug, about what type of player from college turns out the best. The star that is now going to be a role player, the role player that's going to be the same type of role player, or a guy that it doesn't play that much and turns into an NBA role player based on certain traits. And so I think he's a good example of those first two options of which one leads to the better chance of being a good role player. And it's a legitimate argument for him.
Well, I think of Andrew Nembhard, obviously, as a Gonzaga person. That's somebody who comes to mind. He was also a much older prospect, which is a significant difference. But Nembhard was drafted to basically play the same role he played at Gonzaga, and it has worked marvelously for the Indiana Pacers. So you can kind of see how that shakes out. And it kind of leads into, I know Emoni Bates is not a point guard, obviously, but it kind of leads into the conversation about him, because one of the big challenges I think about identifying Bates's NBA draft situation right now, obviously he was this really highly touted high school prospect, which clearly kind of can cloud the judgment for NBA scouts. Even people who do this professionally, it's hard to not remember, hey, that guy was the best player in high school for like multiple years. But now we're seeing a guy, he's at a mid-major school, he's at Eastern Michigan, but he's at times absolutely dominant. 29 consecutive points in a recent game for them. That is unbelievable. He finished with 43 in that game, an efficient 43 in that contest, a monster game from Emoni Bates. But since then, he's played 2 games since then. I think he's had 19 and 17 points, if I'm not mistaken, something along those lines. But he's gone 4 of 16 from deep in those 2 games. So we're starting to see some inconsistency, as you might expect from a guy who has, the weight of this entire basketball program at Eastern Michigan on his back. When he gets into the NBA, especially because he's kind of mocked in that second round spot right now, he's not going to be handed a starting role as a small forward and a high usage rate. There's just no chance that that's going to happen. So how do you evaluate a player who right now is playing a role that is so dramatically different from the role he's likely going to have in the NBA? That's kind of a difficult question, I know, for anybody to answer. If scouts had this down to a science, we wouldn't see a lot of bad draft picks, but occasionally we do. So I'm curious kind of your thoughts on Bates in general and kind of how GMs and scouts and analysts are kind of dealing with him right now.
Yeah, the first thing is that he's a very good shooter, despite shooting in recently 4 of 16. Yeah. I would say just watching him shoot, you can tell he's a very good shooter. He's shooting 36% from 3 on a difficult 3-point shooting. Like there's a difference from 36% on catch and shoot, and then there is from shooting the shots he shoots. Right. And so I think if you were to simplify his role, his shooting percentage gets better. Now the question is, can he defend? He's still very frail. He's still young. Like he's the age of an actual freshman right now. So people are using like, oh, he's been in school for a while and he's transferred as knocked. I would say that his Memphis experience helped him grow in the sense that he was played a role on that team, and he wasn't like used to it, and so he had growing pains. But the reason, and you'll know this as a Gonzaga fan, when he came into that game against Gonzaga, there was legitimate fear because they had the NBA caliber athletes and some finesse for that he presented rather than just athletes.
Right.
And so I think there's a legitimate role for him to just be a 3-and-D guy. He needs to work on his defense, and he needs to work on some attitude concerns, not in the sense that he's like a toxic cancer, and I don't want it to be misinterpreted that way. It's just that when you've been given the ball your entire life and you're the guy on all your teams, and he ran into this a little bit at Memphis, and now you're benched, and now you transfer. There's just a bad connotation, and I think now he's maturing. So I would take, depends the team. So I'll say this: it depends the team, but I would take a flyer on him in the very end of the first round, and because if you hit on that, there are very few people that have the upside of a guy like Emoni Bates. And if you don't, it's not the end of the world. So if that's your only pick, maybe not the safest. But if you have a couple, I don't think that's a bad idea. And I think at the second round, you're getting a solid value because you're getting a guy who's an NBA shooter already, who's tall. Like, you don't get too many 6'9" NBA shooters that have had to shoulder the load he's shouldered. And so I think there's a worthwhile risk. A worthwhile reward to compensate for the risk that you're taking, and taking a guy that has been in 2 different programs. He's transferred to a small school, and his shot selection's questionable, and all these things you can say. I think there's an end that justifies the means.
Well, Leaf, there are so many big games coming up this weekend. And for those of you out there who like to wager on upsets using FanDuel, you cannot miss our Upset Watch segment coming up. But first, today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Built Bar. If you're looking for a delicious treat, but you don't want all of the fat and calories, then you have got to try a Built Bar. We just got through the holidays, and I know my goal is to eat a little bit healthier this year. If you're like me, where you want to eat healthier, but you don't want to compromise taste, then man, I've got just the thing for you. You've got to try Built. With Built, healthy is actually tasty. Seriously, they're so delicious, you won't even think they're good for you. They're perfect for your New Year's resolution. What makes Built Bars so good? Well, for starters, they're covered in 100% real chocolate. That is right, real chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and coconut almond. I'm not sure how Built does it, but these bars taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. They have only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and a whopping 17 grams of protein. And now you don't need to wait around to get a box. For years, we've been talking about ordering your Built Bars at Built.com. Now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. That's right. Head to your nearest Walmart today, walk to the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built Bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs at Walmart's or Sam's Club today. All right, Leaf, want to talk? My favorite segment of the week, every week, is Upset Watch, taking a look at some high-profile games coming up over the weekend or later in the week, where we think that the underseeded team or the non-ranked team could potentially pull off an upset. And frankly, Leaf, I know we talked about this before we started recording. There weren't a lot of great options this week. There's a lot of teams that, I thought, maybe they're a little banged up. They might be a team that could fall, but they're at home or they're playing one of the worst teams in the conference. And so it's like, I'm not sure I found too many games that I wanted. And I know that you and I ended up agreeing on a handful of games. So I want to start with the first game that I picked here, which was on February 4th, 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. on the East Coast, Oklahoma State against TCU. The big kind of hinge here in this game is, as of right now, as we're recording this on Wednesday morning, I don't know if Mike Miles is going to play for TCU, and that really kind of moves the needle in a significant way. We just saw TCU pull off a victory over West Virginia. It was not an easy one, not an easy victory over Bob Huggins' team, and they did that without Mike Miles, in part because they did return one of their big men, Eddie Lampkin. It was kind of a surprise that he was back on the floor for them, assuming he's healthy against Oklahoma State. That's going to help their cause, but OK State's one of the best defensive teams in the entire country. 7th right now in KenPom. Eye test backs that up. This is a very good defensive team. They're at home. They're playing a TCU team that might be missing their best player, their starting point guard. It's pretty easy to see why this one might end up being an upset and a victory for Oklahoma State.
Yeah, that's one I circled on my calendar as well. I think if Mike Miles does not play, it's going to be very difficult to manufacture points. I think Damian Baugh is one of the most underrated players in the country. I absolutely love watching him play. Shahada Wells will really need to play well to give supplementary scoring. But the thing that you lack in Mike Miles is not only do you lose your top scorer, but you lose your top playmaker, someone who really provides a pressure on a defense and creates shots for guys like Chuck O'Bannon and Emmanuel Miller, who both struggled without him, even though they were able to escape with a win against West Virginia. That said, Oklahoma State isn't a good offensive team, so I think TCU is going to be able to keep this close. I would not be shocked if they win. Right. But playing in Stillwater, Musa Cisse defending the basket for a team that can't shoot in TCU, I think this has upset written on it as well. TCU, though, is, as any of you who've listened to me, I really like their team. So don't take this as, oh, they're pretenders. I think it's more of a testament to how good the Big 12 is, and Oklahoma State's a solid team in their own right.
Well, one more upset that I'm going to pick, and I know you got one that you want to close the show out with, Leaf, but we got to talk here about the potential for the number one team in the country, because they have the Purdue Boilermakers. Try that again. They have one of the toughest tests they're going to face all year long in the Big Ten. They're going on the road, Assembly Hall, Indiana Hoosiers. That game also on February 4th. Look, Purdue they haven't looked indestructible. They had the loss to Rutgers. They've had a handful of close games. And you could make an argument that, the Big Ten's kind of weak this year. And I would hear that argument. I think it's reasonable that the Big Ten is maybe not as good as they have been in the past. But Purdue has put together a monster season. There's no debate about that. Matt Painter, absolutely fantastic work with the freshman guards, with, of course, Zach Edey, who looks like the very clear front runner for National Player of the Year. But Trace Jackson Davis has been incredible. Again, we just talked about him in the second segment there. 18 points, 20 boards against Maryland. It's going to come down to Jalen Hood-Schifino. We know that if he has a really monster game, if he does what we know he's capable of doing, he could frustrate the other freshman guards at Purdue, put up some big numbers. I think there's a very reasonable chance that a packed madhouse in Indiana could frustrate Purdue enough to potentially pull off a victory. Having said that, somebody's got to guard Zach Edey. That's not going to be easy. If Hood-Schifino puts up 3 points on 1 of 14 shooting like he did against Maryland, there's probably very, very little chance that Indiana wins that one. But ultimately, I think that they're going to come in pissed off. They're going to be upset about this loss to Maryland. They're going to be at home, and I think there's a reasonable chance that they put together a victory against Purdue and the number one team in the country.
Yeah, I think the fact that they lost to Maryland and disrupted their rhythm of winning is actually a huge advantage in this game, because they'll be able to reevaluate, okay, how do we go about this? Obviously, the main priority is defending Edey. How do they do that? How do they do that without getting Trace Jackson Davis in foul trouble? Because Zach Edey draws fouls at an enormous rate. But I don't think you're going to sacrifice and go like, hey, we're going to go big. Like, I don't think you put a 6'6" Race Thompson on him. I don't think you put a freshman Malik Renew on him. Right. So that's the question. And then it's whose guards can provide the supplementary scoring for a guy like Trace Jackson Davis or Zach Edey, and whose guards score more is going to win this game. So I agree. Upset watch. Would I bet on it? Not certain, but I certainly have my eye on it. My last one is a mid-major one, and teams that people kind of both prognosticated would be good, and then one that's emerged, and that's FAU and UAB. I think UAB's got the recipe to have a chance to upset FAU, who's been ranked for the past week, I guess now 2 weeks. Yep. And I think that their guards always give them a chance. The fact that it's being played in Alabama gives them even a better chance. Is my confidence level through the roof? I think sometimes Andy and I have ones where we're like, okay, this is the right team. And a few weeks ago we went 4 for 4 as a show, so that was fun. But I can't say I'm that confident this time, but I would say anytime you got the two best guards on the floor, you're playing at home, and you're the underdog, and you're probably a mid-major March Madness type of team, it's worth a shot. So that's one I'd advise to take a look at, even if you play the spread rather than full out money line upset. But Jelly Walker, that's a guy to watch, and Gaines is pretty good too. And so watch out for the UAB squad.
All right, that is going to do it for us today. Thanks to Leaf, as always, for coming on the show. Don't forget, as a listener, to subscribe on YouTube if you haven't done so yet. Leave us a review on iTunes. You can find the podcast wherever you already get podcasts. All right, thank you all for listening, and for now, peace out.